just like, this is like, hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. My name is AnnaBella. I upload occasionally. Anyways, today I want to start a new series on my channel. Hopefully I make more videos in this, we'll see. So I actually read 5,567 pages to do this review. And I am, you guessed it, reviewing A Song of Ice and Fire, which I have completed. Just to make this clear, this review is not spoiler free. None of these reviews are gonna be spoiler free because literally how do you review a whole series if it's spoiler free? Like you literally can't, like how do you review book 2 because you're gonna spoil book 1 and there's like, look at them all. Like it's just not, it's not possible. So this is not spoiler free. I'm just gonna warn you ahead of time. Now, this review would take a very long time if it was super in detail and in depth, but instead we're gonna make it fun. And I am gonna make some cookies. We're gonna talk about this book, we're gonna make some cookies, I'm gonna eat the cookies. I mean, you can also eat cookies. They're not gonna be my cookies because I'm eating my cookies, but like if that's what you're into, like, I mean, follow along. I have the recipe here, so like, we'll see. Now we're gonna have a Song of Ice and Fire review, we're gonna make some cookies, and we're gonna have a great time. I wrote down a list of things that I wanted to talk about that I thought was important for a review of an epic this length. While we talk about characters, I'm gonna start this recipe. So this is a vegan recipe. I'm not gonna go over every single like point of view because there's so many and some of them like I just personally think are boring. Characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. There are so many characters, I literally could not number them all, but only some of them have point of views. One of which is the infamous Jon Snow. So starting with Jon Snow and his tale at the wall. Jon's chapters are interesting, but can also be extremely dry. Out of every character, I would say that Jon shows the most growth. Some people may argue with me. They may say Dany or Sansa. I would very much struggle to call him a feminist character. He switches Gilly's baby forcibly with Mance Rayder's baby, and I think that's a pretty crap thing to do. As a whole, I actually think Jon shows a lot of growth and development, especially in Dance with Dragons. Storm of Swords, sort of, but mostly in Dance with Dragons. We see how he's trying to be more political, and I think Jon would have had the capacity to play the Game of Thrones very well, but the issue is that like he doesn't have anyone guiding him. Like Sansa learns how to play the Game of Thrones from Littlefinger. Jon, if he had had a Littlefinger, probably would not have ended up stabbed through the heart. Spoiler alert, whoops. But as a whole, Jon's chapters are very interesting and they're definitely supposed to give us the background information necessary for the others. But as a whole, Jon's chapters are pretty interesting. I don't care about what happens in Dorne at this point. Like, I like Dorne, don't get me wrong, but like, I don't care what happens in Dorne because like, we literally don't see Dorne until like book 3, so why do we care? So the next thing we're gonna add is 3/4 of a cup of dark sugar. Another character who has plenty of point of view chapters is Cersei. Cersei is very interesting in her point of view. She has a lot to say. One of the most prominent themes that we see in her chapter is actually woman hating. She is really sexist against other women. She thinks of Elia Martell as being weak and frail and not a true woman because of her fertility issues. She also thinks of Lyanna Stark as being a dog or a wolf woman and not a true enough woman for Rhaegar. Cersei seems to believe that if she had married Rhaegar Targaryen that her life would have been better and she would have been a better queen. She hates her husband, Robert Baratheon, which is why she has a hand in murdering him. Cersei is also one of the main areas in which we see incest in a negative light. We see incest negatively across Song of Ice and Fire, and it's very clear that in the beginning, George is trying to show us that incest is wrong. However, with Daenerys' character, who's been built up to be such a strong and prolific character and incredibly epic as she is, people start to question if that is truly one of the themes that we're supposed to see in Song of Ice and Fire. Cersei is a very complex character, Jaime less so. Jaime has two things that he enjoys, Cersei and fighting. The fighting goes hand in hand with his ability to be a knight. And yet, in the early portions of A Song of Ice and Fire, Jaime has very little morals. He has no sense of guilt when he pushes Bran off of the broken tower. Yet when his character meets Brienne, he definitely changes. He's a much more complex character after this point and starts thinking about the repercussions of his actions because he's inspired by Brienne's worthiness and her sense of honor. In fact, after Joffrey's untimely death at his own wedding, we see Jaime's point of view, and he's more interested in the mark that he's going to leave on the world. He starts to look at the book in which all of the Kingsguards have written their time and wonders what he's done to actually be a good knight. Interestingly, the one thing that people curse him for, which was killing the king, King Aerys Targaryen, is also the only thing that he did that should have gotten him praised. He saved many women and children in that event as the king was ready to burn all of King's Landing. Let's talk about Sansa next. Sansa is definitely a character where some people are going to love her and some people are going to hate her. Personally, I'm on the hate end. I really don't like Sansa. A lot of people claim that she has a lot of character growth. Yes, it's true, but she's also like, takes her so long to like learn how to like not be annoying. She just like does stuff. Like in book 1, there's like a scene where Jane Poole, her friend, is like worried that her dad's been killed, and Sansa literally tells her like, get over it, it's fine, you don't have the right to be mad. Like, that's a bad friend, okay? Just saying. Bad friend. Sansa's chapters though do give us a really interesting perspective on the human ramifications of the War of Five Kings, and honestly we do see a lot of character growth, not in her actions but in her thought process. Sansa definitely learns to become more savvy, but that doesn't mean she's less annoying. Her chapters are interesting though, because I think we could definitely get to see like a much greater area of Westeros through her, because like first she's in the north, and then she's in like the Riverlands, then she's in King's Landing, then she's in the Vale. Like we see a lot, I feel, from her chapters, and we do get to learn a lot of important things in her chapters, but there are some mistakes that she makes that are like pretty big. One of which is her shoe falling through the moon door when her Aunt Liza was murdered. I'm not going to go into detail about that. If you guys read that chapter a little closely, you will see that there is no way that the Royces are going to swallow the horse crap that Littlefinger is feeding them. Now I'm going to add the salt to this recipe. It calls for 1 teaspoon, so I'm just going to add that right now. I feel like talking about Ned at this point is kind of dumb because he's literally only in one book before his head gets chopped off. So like, honestly, the only thing that we learn about the most important thing that we learn in Ned's chapter is how not to behave, because he has an overly strict view of how people should behave, and honestly it literally puts him at a disadvantage. It literally puts him at a disadvantage, and that is supposed to be like on purpose. Like we're supposed to see how Jon should not behave. Yeah, so in case you were wondering, the point of Ned Stark, it's that. 1 teaspoon of salt, coconut oil. Another character we're gonna chat about is gonna be Catelyn. Now, Cat is a very polarizing character in Song of Ice and Fire. Some people love her, some people hate her, and the people who feel either way feel it on extreme ends. There is no in between. Why? Because through Cat we see extreme child abuse. She's very abusive towards Jon. We're definitely supposed to see that in book 1 with her behavior in the period where Bran was injured. But she's also a character that goes through a lot of change. This doesn't happen in the TV show, but in the books, she's resurrected by a Red Priest and becomes Lady Stoneheart. Her character there is very, very different, and she's super cool. I like her, and I hate Cat, so. Okay, now we're gonna add 1/2 cup of refined coconut oil. So while I am creaming together my coconut oil and insane amount of sugar, we're gonna chat about the Brienne chapters. Now, the Brienne chapters are pretty boring to read. I understand some people are super interested in Brienne's chapter arc, but like it's literally so dull. Oh my god. Not gonna lie, I love Brienne. Don't take this the wrong way. I mentioned this in another video. Love Brienne. Brienne's chapters are definitely supposed to show us the lives of the small folk. She really introduces proto-democracy in her chapters, which I think is very important. George R. R. Martin has said that somebody will end up on the Iron Throne. To me, it seems pretty silly to spend many chapters of a book exploring democracy, the lives of the small folk, etc., if democracy is not the end game to the story. I understand that it's supposed to give us a better idea of like the people of Westeros, how they feel during the war, because we really only see things from the eyes of the nobility. Her storyline is categorized by it, and it doesn't need to. I would like to know more about her. How does she feel about things? I feel like Brienne is an excellent example of a character who has honor, but also has strength. She's very different from Ned in the sense that her honor is malleable. She will change based on the situation. She's not honorable to a fault like Ned is, and not almost dishonorable like Arya is, for example. Speaking of Arya, let's chat about Arya. Arya is a bad bitch. I'm gonna have to bleep that out. Good job, AnnaBella. She's one of my favorite characters, without a doubt. And the reason for that is that I think that Arya shows an incredible amount of strength. Sansa is strong too, but not in the same way as Arya. I think Arya is a proto-feminist character. She doesn't think of equality as equality. She thinks of herself as being something more. She wants to be more than what women were in this period or in this story. Arya's chapters also take us to some very interesting places. When we see Arya's character develop, we are definitely seeing what could have been Lyanna, or what was Lyanna, based on, you know, which theory you believe about what actually happened to her. How do I think that Arya's story will end? Well, that depends. I think that there's a very strong chance that she's going to become her wolf. Vanilla. 1 teaspoon vanilla extract. There are many points in A Song of Ice and Fire in which Arya thinks about what it would be like to be a wolf, or how she would feel if she were a wolf. She even decides not to journey towards the wall to Jon because she thinks that she would be better suited in her life to be a wolf. Now that the oat milk and the vanilla are in, I'm just gonna keep mixing this until it looks, you know, mildly smooth. Looks very gritty. I don't know if I messed up or not. Whatever, who cares? You're not eating it, trust me. Finally, Dany. Dany's character arc is very different from most characters. Why? We see someone who is determined to live in the past and yet refuses to go back to the past. Dany often thinks to herself that if she looks back, she is lost. However, she also thinks of herself as Rhaegar's heir. So she's very stuck in the past while also trying to avoid her past. I think there's a very strong possibility that Dany is actually Rhaegar's bastard daughter by Ashara Dane. That's an entirely other thing. If you guys want to learn about that, I would check out Reddit. But there are some very interesting themes in Dany's character arc. We're going to talk mostly about those later in the problematic section. But one of the things that I find the most interesting is the way that Dany views herself and others. She very much seems to believe that the small folk have the ability to become something more. Yet some of what she does in practice doesn't necessarily mirror this theory, I guess. She seems to do things sometimes that are very hypocritical. But what's interesting about Daenerys' character is that George R. R. Martin has definitely created her to be the male ideal fantasy of what a woman could or should be. She's strong and independent, but not too strong or too independent. She's pliable and yet firm. It's very interesting how one character can do all of these things. I actually think that one of the reasons The Winds of Winter is taking so incredibly long for George R. R. Martin to finish is that he's wrote himself into a corner with Daenerys. He's built up this massive character who has a cult following. In both the TV shows and in the books, people are very interested in seeing where Daenerys' story arc goes, one of which is people's belief that she'll end up on the Iron Throne. I don't think that this is the case. Hear me out. I actually believe that Daenerys' character is going to have to die in childbirth. Why do I think this? In Game of Thrones, we only see 4 characters who die in childbirth. Lyanna Stark, who is Ned Stark's mother, Lyanna Stark, if theories are to be believed, Rhaella Targaryen, and Joanna Lannister. There's been a lot of debate about the idea that because Daenerys' mother died in childbirth and because Jon's mother, if it is truly Lyanna Stark, died in childbirth, Daenerys and Jon would also have a relationship and that Daenerys would die in childbirth. I think that this is a very strong possibility, as it's an easier way to come across the idea of Nissa Nissa or the Lightbringer. I don't really know how to describe it perfectly, but it comes down to the idea that there's a hero that will bring the dawn during the long night. In this theory, the prince who was promised has to temper his sword 3 times to create Lightbringer. One of those times has to be in the heart of his beloved. If Daenerys dies in childbirth or is dying in childbirth, Jon can feasibly stab her through the heart and have Lightbringer. So I think that's a definite possibility for her story arc. Do I like that ending? Not really. Does George seem to like that ending? I don't think so, which is why this is taking so long for him to complete. How much flour? 1.5 cups. And we moved on to the second portion of my review video, which is perfect because we're starting to move on to the dry ingredients. Plot lines. Ugh, there's so many in Song of Ice and Fire, which I think is also a reason why George R. R. Martin is taking so long to finish this series. He can't feasibly wrap everything up in the amount of books that he has left. I really think that he's added so many plot lines that I don't feasibly know how he's going to finish it all up in 3,600 pages, which is what he said that it's going to take to finish this. He's also said that Winds of Winter is going to be 1,800 pages and A Dream of Spring is going to be 1,800 pages. I'm not sure how true that is. I don't know if any publishing house would be willing to wrap an 1,800 page book. I mean, I'd be willing to read it. It might take me some time, but I would read it. I'm also going to add 1/2 teaspoon of baking soda. Let's get back to the point of this, which was the book, not the baking. So the plot lines in Game of Thrones are both clear and convoluted. Why do I say this? Well, a lot of them seem to go nowhere. I'm not trying to insult George R. R. Martin's work when I say that. What I mean to say is that he tends to plant seeds very early on in his stories and then add things later if it suits him. He doesn't necessarily wrap up the storylines as much as he grows them to become other stories later, if that makes sense. There's a lot of Song of Ice and Fire theories out on the internet, and I do believe that one of the reasons for that is because George R. R. Martin is so incredibly good at adding storylines that might not necessarily come to fruition or may evolve in a way that really surprises readers. Stylistically, George R. R. Martin's plot lines are very intriguing. However, there are some serious flaws in some of the plot lines that he writes. It's not necessarily plot holes, it's his own issue of sort of adding some things too late. Dorne is not discussed until quite late in the story, and that's why a lot of people don't really care about what happens in Dorne. There is some issue with this. I think that people are very uninterested in the Dornish plot lines solely because it happens so late in the story. By that time, they're really only interested in what's happening with the Starks and the Lannisters and Daenerys Targaryen. If the Dornish do have a larger role to play later in the story, George R. R. Martin has sort of stabbed himself in the foot with this specific plot line. Do I think that's a bad thing? Not necessarily, but I think that for some readers who are nervous about undertaking the task of reading 5,567 pages, it's a little bit much. So the general plot line of A Song of Ice and Fire is kind of hard to say because there's so many themes present and so many characters present. If a person had to describe Song of Ice and Fire in a single paragraph, I would not say necessarily that it was a fight for the Iron Throne. I would say that it is a story in which we blur the lines of what good versus evil means and how do we overcome the issues that people face in their daily lives. One of the things that is the most interesting with those plots is actually incest. We'll talk about this more when we discuss themes. There are certain taboo subjects that George R. R. Martin seriously delves into in this story. And what I think is actually most interesting and most important is the discussion of incest, child abuse, sexuality. There are many different ways that he interrogates these plot lines in his story. Generally, A Song of Ice and Fire is a story about nobility who are fighting over a throne and don't realize that something is going to be coming. That's very vague, but the theme of it is very clear. The idea here is that someone has to rule. What does that mean? No democracy, which, like I said earlier, we discussed when I talked about the Brienne chapters. Democracy is very strongly a theme in Brienne's chapters, and yet it's not the end game of the story. So what is George R. R. Martin trying to tell us? I couldn't say exactly because the series is finished, but there's definitely something that he wants us to pick up on. Those are the most important things about plot lines in A Song of Ice and Fire. There are a lot of other plot lines happening. We have what's happening in the Vale, we have what's happening in the Riverlands, we have what's happening in Dorne, in the Crownland. In fact, in A Feast of Crows, that's where we see plot become extremely heavy in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's always present, but in A Feast for Crows, we see the human repercussions of the War of Five Kings. However, did I like A Feast for Crows? No. It was probably one of the lowest ranked books that I read this year. I really didn't enjoy it. It was very dense and very plot heavy, and there wasn't enough like fantasy. It was very like Cersei this and Cersei that. Let's talk about themes. So we've already started to discuss the importance of incest in A Song of Ice and Fire. So you're supposed to add 4 ounces of vegan chocolate chunks and chocolate chips. I don't actually know what 4 ounces comes to, so I'm just gonna drop it in and like hope for the best. Incest as a theme in A Song of Ice and Fire is definitely meant to show us a lesson. As I've stated before, George R. R. Martin is very clearly trying to show us that incest is wrong, and yet he breaks his own point by having Daenerys be such a strong, independent, and prolific character. Yet we're still meant to see incest in a negative light, considering the relationship between Cersei and Jaime. Through Cersei and Jaime, we see the very clear repercussions of incest. Joffrey's character is also supposed to show this, as he is very clearly insane. We also see this with Aerys. Aerys is a product of incest, and yet Daenerys breaks this trend. Why? As I said before, I think George R. R. Martin did this accidentally. I don't think that he meant to create Daenerys as such a prolific character as she's become, but he's writing through it. So my batter is technically done, but we're gonna let this chill and harden so that I can roll it out and we can create awesome shapes and continue talking about Song of Ice and Fire. So if you guys are thinking, wow, AnnaBella, the lighting looks different, you look different, the world looks different, it's because it does. This is an hour later. I have been chilling my beautiful dough, and now we are ready to roll it out and make something beautiful. So what's interesting about the incest theme in Song of Ice and Fire is if Daenerys is actually the child of Rhaegar and Ashara Dayne, that completely negates the point of he's showing incest as both bad and good. So it really just depends on like what happens in Winds of Winter. It's really hard to say for sure what things are important and what is not, because we are still missing like 3,600 pages, which is like a lot. Now we are going to talk about the problems in A Song of Ice and Fire. Believe it or not, there are not that many problems in A Song of Ice and Fire, but the places where there are problems, they're very serious. The biggest of which is slavery in A Song of Ice and Fire. Slavery is a massive theme in A Song of Ice and Fire. It's exceptionally important to Daenerys Targaryen's story arc. Daenerys' character is really based on slavery. Everything that's important about her comes from her relationship with slavery. She herself feels enslaved by her brother, and so this drives her to begin her campaign in Slaver's Bay instead of going straight to Westeros when she has her army. And it is something that we see in her point of view all the time across all of the books where she is a parent. And yet it seems that her views on slavery are quite hypocritical. George R. R. Martin has made Daenerys' character so positive in order for the reader to enjoy her. But what is unfortunate about that is that everything that Daenerys' character has come from slavery, and that is actually very problematic, because it almost seems as though Daenerys is meant to be a man's ideal image of a woman, and the slavery portion of this is a clear place where we see this. As a woman of color with a higher education degree, where I focus pretty regularly on aspects of both slavery and feminism, I can definitely say that Daenerys' character does in fact have feminist undertones, and yet at the same time it seems as though her character is not very understanding towards race, racism, and slavery. It seems as though every area in which Daenerys wants to conquer, she decides that she has to change the culture that's there. It seems as though she wants to take the cultures of every place away. This is especially apparent in Dance with Dragons. In fact, I would say in Dance with Dragons, Daenerys is an incredibly bad ruler, and the most obvious example of that is the way that she declines the fighting pits in Meereen, because she doesn't like the idea of it, and yet that is the culture of the community. One thing that I find very interesting is how that parallels imperialism. A culture's own existence is wiped away by the invading force. Daenerys sort of does this in every area that she invades. This opinion may cause some controversy, But Daenerys' character is quite prejudiced. She almost seems like a blood purist. Daenerys does many times say that the reason that she deserves the Iron Throne is because of her blood and her bloodlines. This isn't necessarily a problem, except that rather than looking at her family name, she looks at her Valyrian heritage. Some readers may not necessarily see that as a prejudice. I do see it as the beginnings of a blood purity outlook. It may seem from these discussions that I dislike Daenerys. This is untrue. I actually really enjoy her as a character, but we find most of the problems in A Song of Ice and Fire in Daenerys' character. So now that my shapes are done, I'm gonna pop these in the oven for 12 to 15 minutes and we're gonna see how these cookies turned out. Most of the issues in A Song of Ice and Fire that are not related to actual content come from the fact that George R. R. Martin has created such a dense universe. Obviously, the largest issue in A Song of Ice and Fire is that it is not complete, and we don't know when it will be complete. George R. R. Martin writes, but not necessarily quickly. That might be because he tends to spend a lot of time developing plot lines that are not necessarily super important to the story. No one knows if it's actually going to be finished. Hear me out. People are convinced that George R. R. Martin is not going to finish his books. I don't necessarily agree with that, but I understand why people feel that way because it's been so long and he keeps telling us, oh, it's coming, and it hasn't come yet. I think that the bigger issue is that he's written himself into a corner because he has created so many plot lines, so many characters, etc. And now he's at a point where there's so much that he quite literally cannot wrap up all of the loose ends that he had planned. Song of Ice and Fire is extremely difficult to read. It's very dense, the language is very coarse, a lot of the themes are quite unclear, there's a lot of illusion, the characters are all over the place, there are so many points of view. It's incredibly difficult to read, and I can only imagine that it's even more difficult to write. And that way I think it makes it far more difficult for him to finish his work. He has so much to write and so many plot lines. Do I think this is necessarily a problem? No, but I could see how many people might be turned off from the idea of reading it because there's so much to read and who knows when the next portion of the series is coming out. Fire and Blood has come out recently. Fire and Blood is a companion series to A Song of Ice and Fire. It focuses on the Targaryen legacy in Westeros, starting from Aegon's conquest to the time of Daenerys Targaryen. The first portion of this book is about 750 pages, and it is only one half of the complete Fire and Blood manuscript. People loved this book, but it's also being boycotted by a lot of Song of Ice and Fire fans because they feel like they were disrespected, which I get that. If you've been waiting for ages for Winds of Winter, you just want Winds of Winter. You don't necessarily care about prequel information. But I really enjoyed it. I think it gave a lot of insight into future things that may happen in A Song of Ice and Fire if you read close enough. So what are my all-in-all thoughts about A Song of Ice and Fire? Well, I think that it's an excellent epic fantasy. If you think that you can finish all of what has been written and enjoy it, then I say you go for it. Individually, I would have to say some of the books are more difficult to read than others. A Game of Thrones is an excellent book, so is A Storm Swords. A Clash of Kings is like okay, but Feast for Crows is personally my least favorite book. A lot of people feel this way, it's not just me. And Dance with Dragons is okay because it has some of my favorite characters in it, and yet it put me into a reading slump because I felt like a lot of what was being said there was not really that important. I think that Daenerys' story arc in Meereen is kind of unnecessary. Like, the only thing it's shown us is that she's a bad ruler, which is important, but there's no reason that we needed to spend 1,000 pages on that. Like, it could have been done in like half of that amount, so there's that. If I had to give it a rating, I would say I think Song of Ice and Fire is 4 stars. Because I think that some of the plot lines are a little bit gratuitous. It's not the plot itself, it's how many there are in relation to how much pages we have left. I don't necessarily think it's possible for him to finish up his story. I also have issues with like the slavery theme, which I already discussed. Yet I think that the story is really unique. It has excellent themes. It explores some interesting ideas that I don't see in other books. So I would say 4 stars. Do I recommend it to others? Yes. I think if you can start reading it and you feel comfortable getting through the first book, then you'll probably be able to finish the series. A lot of people tend to give up after A Storm of Swords, but I think that book 4, if you can power through it, does have excellent implications. It wasn't necessarily my favorite book to read. I really disliked it actually, but I think it shows very important themes that are not present in other places in the story. I also think that book 5 had some interesting plot points, and yet it seems to me as though some of the things in that book were not necessary. Okay, so my cookies are ready, which means now not only will you get a Song of Ice and Fire review, you will also get a cookie review. We'll see. So they look very brown and very greasy. Also, you cannot literally at all tell that they had cookie cutouts, so there's that. Love that. I'm gonna put my second regular non-Song of Ice and Fire themed batch in. Now I'm gonna let my cookies cool for like 10 minutes and then they'll be fine. Okay, I am back and I have some cooled cookies. So let's try one of the Game of Thrones ones. It's really hard, I'm already nervous. Oh God. Okay, well, the taste is fine, but it's really hard. Let's try to soak it for a minute. Oh my God, that's so difficult to chew. What the heck? Nope. Nope. All right, let's try one of the not Game of Thrones shaped ones. See, this one's like soft and mushy. This is a good cookie. Why did they come out so different? Maybe it's because the Game of Thrones one was like spread and then it was like too thin and then it burnt. I think that's what happened. Whatever. If you liked this video, then like this video, subscribe to my channel. Tell me what series you want me to review. I am reading one right now, but I'm open to your suggestions for the next series that I should read and do a review. So let me know. Have a great day, guys.